Well, hello again, and I'm Mark Morgan, and this is the Egyptian Magic Podcast.
Before me in the east Nephthys, behind me in the west Isis, on my right hand in the south is Seth, and on my left hand in the north is Horus. For about me shines the body of Nuit, and below me extends the ground of Geb, and in the centre abideth the great hidden God. So there are three parts to what I'm going to talk to you about now. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about Crowley and what happened after Crowley. Second, I'm going to talk about Typhonians in the past. And third, I'm going to talk about the magic of future selves. So just to get us going, assume then that the word Typhonian in the title, it means the magic of Aleister Crowley. More especially the magic of the ancient god Seth, or Set if you like, god of intoxication, chaos and confusion. We will gradually unravel some of his mysteries as the talk unfolds. As is perhaps well known amongst those here gathered, followers of Crowley, including the OTO, claim to have a secret, and that's a secret capable of realizing the world-old dream of the brotherhood of man. And in general, the secret is connected with an unknown or hidden god and the mysteries of a sexual nature. No one has the complete version of the secret. I've discussed this with various representatives of surviving magical orders, and the fact is that it's still a discussion. Tells you something. Okay, so first of all, let's talk a little bit about Crowley after Crowley. Crowley died in 1947. I thought I'd better mention that, as some people are still convinced that he's still alive. Even so, there are many amongst us, myself included, whose heart leaps when they hear his name. So, leap away. Now I'm going to avoid or bracket out a knotty argument as to who is the rightful successor to Crowley's mantle. There are maybe half a dozen organisations that have staked a claim so far, and naturally enough they all have some validity. But because this talk is about Typhonian magic, it's difficult to avoid the works of Kenneth Grant. Grant's work is valued beyond the narrow confines of his now tiny faction of the OTO. For example, the SOTO, Societas, Order Templi Orientis, is one of the stronger claimants to the crown, but nevertheless still seems to value Kenneth Grant's work more highly than their own founder. Their founder was Marcello Motta. Now, Kenneth Grant was born in 1925, and he first encountered Crowley through a copy of Magic in Theory and Practice that he bought at the Atlantis bookshop in London. He was just 15 at the time, and by his own account his main interest was Eastern mysticism. The graphic artist Alan Moore describes Kenneth Grant at the time as a schoolboy gone berserk on brimstone aftershave. Give you that one again. A schoolboy gone berserk on brimstone aftershave. He later wrote to Crowley, as Kenneth Grant later wrote to Crowley, becoming his unpaid secretary, working principal on one of Crowley's final books called Magic Without Tears. Now, Crowley apparently wanted to groom Kenneth Grant as a possible future leader for the Thelemic movement. But Crowley was a very, very demanding teacher, and Kenneth Grant was a very difficult student. For example, Crowley wrote to Kenneth Grant telling him he really must put a sock in it if he wants to work with the order. And later, there is a terrible defect in your outlook on life. You cannot be content with the simplicity of reality and fact. You have to go off into a pipe dream. Again, that was Aleister Crowley to Kenneth Grant, quoted by Alan Moore, and it's apparently in the collection of letters that stands as Grant's 1991 biography, although to be honest I couldn't find it when I looked. So if anybody's got any clues on that, that'd be handy. Kenneth Grant did eventually become one of the most prominent of Crowley's successors, which proves the old maxim, if you want to succeed, you have to succeed. You have to work that out for yourself. His prominence is in part due to his writing, really, his books on occult topics, starting quite early on in the 1960s with a thing called the Carfax Monographs. Then he wrote a series of articles on Eastern gurus for a very innovative publication called Man, Myth and Magic. And then in 1973, within the first few pages of that book, The Magical Revival, Grant offers us one of the earliest definitions of what a Typhonian is. So I'll quote him here. The magical tradition, which included sex as a means of spiritual attainment, existed long before the dynastic times in ancient Egypt, and there are early references to it in the sacred writings of India and China. In Egypt, this tradition was known as the Draconian or Typhonian cult. It was the first systematized form of early African mysteries. The doctrines which the Egyptians elaborated into a highly specialized cult flowered later into the tantras of India, China, Mongolia and Tibet. But it would be wrong to suppose that Kenneth Grant coined the term Typhonian. Crowley mentions the Typhon often in his works, beginning in 1907 with a book called Liber 231. This is one of the so-called holy books, and just about his earliest commentary on the tarot. Okay, if we look at the sequence of the design of the Tarot Trump, the Wheel of Fortune, we start with the earliest image from the Marseille Tarot, Marseille deck, so-called, which is French, but is based on 15th century Italian themes. Next you've got the card produced by someone called ETL, or the ETL deck, which is Alietta is another one backwards, which was produced, should remind you to orientate you in this, the French Revolution, it was in 1789. So the ETL deck is about a year after the French Revolution. And it's pretty much the same and probably based on the deck of Oswald Worth, which is also 1889. I've got a picture of one of those. Next we come to the Tarot of the Bohemians, which again is was almost 100 years later in 1889. And now in this deck we can sort of see the Typhon starting to appear in the decks, and what's happened in between, of course, is the French Revolution in 1789, then the Reign of Terror, the rise of Napoleon, re-emergence of imperial aims and the conquest of Egypt, and that's the beginning of what you would call Egyptomania. So it becomes clear that even though the Oswald Worth deck claims to be a kind of Egyptian-based tarot, in fact there's very little Egyptian imagery in it. Whereas if you go to Papus and the Tarot of the Bohemians, there's a lot more Egyptian imagery creeping into the card deck, including the Typhon of 1889. The next important step is the most important deck produced by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the so-called Coleman-Smith deck of 1910. And in fact, if you look at the Wheel of Fortune in this deck, then in some ways it's completely lost the association with Egypt, and it's gone back in a way to the sort of medieval demon tradition. So if you really look at the cards, the Typhon is there from the Oswald Tarot, the Coleman Smith wheel returns to its more medieval vision, and the Typhon is fully restored in the Aleister Crowley deck. So the Typhon is something that has been seeping into occult consciousness for the last 200 years now, the process initiated by the rediscovery of ancient Egypt and Egyptomania. So part 2, the Typhonians in history. Typhon is a Greek deity, of course, one of the Titans. He's a vast grisly monster with 100 snake-like heads, with dark, flickering tongues, flashing fire from their eyes, and the din of voices and 100 serpents issuing from his thighs. The Typhon leads the Titans when they attack and kill Dionysus, just as the Egyptian god Set is responsible for the murder of Osiris. Therefore, from the time of the Greek historian Herodotus, the Greek Typhon has been identified with the Egyptian god Set or Seth. Typhon is an important component of the Hermetic tradition. Hermetic magic is a magic that has its roots in ancient Egypt, especially important during the time of the Greek conquest and occupation. A Typhonian in the ancient world is one of the 4 personality types of Egyptian and classical psychology. So 4 different personality types, Set and Horus, Isis and Nephthys. So I'm just going to focus on the Typhonian or the Setian type, where it said the god in him is Set. So if the god inside you is Set, Set, son of Nuit, greater strength, protection is at the hands of thy holiness, I am the son of thy son. So a Setian, a Typhonian. Being a bachelorhood was seen as a very Setian or Typhonian thing to be. Being drunk was another Setian thing. Incidentally, the Egyptians didn't see drunkenness as a wholly bad thing. Drunkenness was for them an important way of communicating with the divine. Those born on certain days were predicted to die by being drunk, to die in a drunken stupor, if you like, but this was thought to be quite a good thing. Thus, in the 2nd month, on the 6th day, if you were born on the 2nd month of the Egyptian year, on the day 6, it was very, very good. It's a happy day, for Ra is in his heaven, and the gods are pacified in his presence. The company of heaven is making whoopee in front of the Lord of the universe. Anyone born on this day will die in a state of drunkenness. Officially, Typhonians are disliked either because they have red hair or some other reasons are believed to be adherents of Seth. The destiny of the Typhonian is subject to different laws. They live a fairly long time. They live, for instance, up to 84 years, according to the Egyptians. Although if they remain unmarried, they live less, to 60 in fact, although some might say it's the other way round. If the god in him, in the person, is Set, then he is a man of the people, the Reket. As I say, red hair, colour, and kind of that sort of associated features. Setians are accident prone. Some recommendations given by the ancient Egyptians. Setians shouldn't drink, because if he drinks a beer, he drinks it only to get angry and to engender turmoil. The redness in his hair becomes the red in his eye, and he drinks even though he doesn't like drinking, just to get angry. So they shouldn't drink, really. Sethians or Typhonians like women, and consequently women like them. And a Sethian, even if a Sethian comes from a more patrician or royal background, he's likely to have the personality of a man of the people. And all of this, the Sethian, the Typhonian personality type, the most famous example is probably King Ramesses II, who was a redhead and lived a heck of a long time, till he was 100, had a lot of wives and children. and was not a good person to know when he was drunk, apparently. Okay, so Typhonian magic in terms of techniques is enormous. It's an enormous body of work and is still growing. I remind you, when Kenneth Grant wrote about it being a magical tradition that included sex as a means to spiritual attainment, and also that it existed long before dynastic times, that it was a highly specialized cult related to the tantras of India, all that sort of stuff, all of that is essentially true, in my opinion. And Grant's early attempts to describe it have over the years been greatly refined, and some of the details have been corrected, but essentially it's correct. And my own researches have, in their own small way, have kind of been focused on trying to refine what Kenneth Grant earlier said. The publication, in 1986, the publication of the complete Greek magical papyri changed forever the older view of what was Hermetic magic, what it was like, and changed what we know about the Typhonians. So this vast publication of material is full of Typhonian magic, really. It's not the only thing there, but it's a hugely important source for anybody wanting to study the magic of Set and Typhon. So it's far too large for me to describe much of it. There's loads of people engaged in this sort of stuff at the moment. So I'm going to focus on one small Typhonian spell which I've been studying for a little while now. And it's a typical piece of Typhonian or Setian magic designed to send evil sleep. So if anybody's asleep now, you might want to wake up. This sort of magic is known as diabolic magic. Diabolic meaning to tear apart, as opposed in alchemy to the symbolic type magic which holds together. If you want to understand some of the underlying principles of Typhonian magic, you have to look at some very unpleasant material. It's true now, and it was true in the past. Thus, we have to look at this sort of diabolic magic of Egypt at about the time of Christ. Egypt had passed from a Greek to a Roman rulership. If you remember, Alexander the Great defeated the Persians and thus took over the Persian Empire, which included Egypt. And then eventually they kind of turned it into just another Greek colony with a sort of form of apartheid between the Greeks and the Egyptians. Eventually, the Romans took over, the whole incident with Cleopatra and Mark Antony and everything, and the Romans take Egypt into direct rule. Contrary to what you might think, that time when Egypt is ruled by first the Greeks and then the Egyptians is actually a very vibrant period. It's a difficult period. The Romans, and before them the Greeks, impose a lot of harsh conditions that make it very, very difficult for the traditional temple-based religion to continue, especially under the Romans. They pretty much banned it in the end. They certainly extracted all the wealth from it and made it very difficult to train priests. So most of what we know of the magic of the period comes from just one magician of that time. And his or her, it could be a woman, it could be a man, nobody knows. Their library, their magical library in their Book of Shadows was unearthed in the early part of the 19th century. We don't really know his or her name, so to make it more user-friendly, I'm going to call him Dewey, which is a name of the time. This magician, Dewey, was a bilingual Egyptian priest or priestess who lived in Thebes. It's possible, if you know a thing called the Mithras liturgy, that the Mithras liturgy is an account of her initiation. The collection, this magician's library, stems, so they think, or is a record of Dewey's study holiday with the magicians of Alexandria. Life for the native Egyptian was difficult. They had to negotiate the apartheid system of the Greeks, then the transition to Roman domination, and finally the growth of Christian fanaticism. So like many other libraries of the period, it was hidden in the ground for the benefit of a future self. The owner never really returned to claim his or her prize, and the most likely thing that happened is that they shared the fate of others of his kind, or her kind, and were murdered by the mob, which was a common enough thing, and the library, if it had been found, would have been burnt. So hidden in the ground, this little library, all buried in pots, was hidden for 2,000 years, in a way waited, incubating in the ground until we were mature enough and ready to receive its secrets again. So we're going to look at one of the ancient witches' diabolical spells. There are many, many similar spells to send evil sleep. This is one of the key things of the time. The dream world is the real theatre of magic in ancient Egypt. The world of dreams and sleep. Protecting against dreams, interpreting dreams, sending dreams. That's all the magic seems to be focused on that. Now the spell is to be completed twice a day, once at sunrise and once at sunset, and repeated for 4 days. If it's done for 4 days, which is a key number within Egyptian magic, it causes the victim to suffer a bad dream. If the process is continued for 7 days, the victim dies. So it can be fatal, this type of magic. This latter feature about the death aspect of the spell is written in code, so it's not that well known, right? It'd have to be decoded before they knew this. The spell, of course, invokes Seth or Typhon to accomplish its aim using diabolic techniques to tear apart. And the way this is done is that the appropriate god is provoked, that Seth is provoked, which is a dangerous thing to do, or antagonized, or desecrated, until he or she becomes so angry that they send a demonic emissary, or even come themselves to trouble the victim in their sleep. In Typhonian magic and in ancient magic, there's no threefold law of return. The magician hopes to remain immune from its effects. Now, the kind of reverence that for the gods that we modern worshippers have is actually quite alien to Egyptian religion. As far as they're concerned, the gods plague us or plague human beings all the time, so they don't see anything wrong with plaguing them a little bit back. So instructions for the spell to cause evil sleep: face the rising or setting sun. The practitioner should place the head of a donkey between his feet. Position his right hand in front and his left hand behind the animal's head. So he sort of covers it with his body. While he's seated on his heels above the head, he has to recite an invocation. Before starting, he anoints his right foot with yellow ochre, his left foot with clay, and puts the donkey's blood on one of his hands and into the corners of his mouth. As a kind of amulet, he should bind a thread of palm fibre to his hands and a piece of male palm fibre to the head and to his phallus. So then the invocation: I call upon you who are in the empty air, you who are terrible, invisible, almighty, God of gods, you who cause destruction and desolation, you who hate a stable household, you who were driven out of Egypt and have roamed foreign lands, you who shatter everything and are not defeated, I call upon you, Typhon, Seth. I command your prophetic powers because I call upon your authoritative name, to which you cannot refuse to listen. Then there's a piece of what's known technically as barbarous names of invocation, using secret coded names of Seth. I missed that bit out. Come to me and go and strike down. Then you put the name so-and-so, or her so-and-so, with chills and fever. That very person who wronged me, and he or she has spilled the blood of Typhon in their own house. For this reason I am doing it. So, you spill the blood of Typhon, but you blame it on someone else. And hopefully the Typhon goes along and tears them apart. The rite and the invocation are linked together through the god Seth, as is fairly obvious, or Typhon. It invokes the connection with Seth by means of the manipulation of the head and blood of a donkey, the animal which was par excellence the god of God Seth in Egyptian temple ritual throughout the whole of that period. The donkey represents Seth. Seth was and is one of the most important gods of ancient Egypt. He was the indigenous god whose cult was eclipsed by the new foreign cult of Osiris in very long time ago in pre-dynastic times. The cult of Seth suffered a long decline until his only remote role remained as personification of evil, a murderer of the corn king Osiris. For a while under the Ramessides, Seth lost that negative character and became, as he was before, guardian of the spirit of monarchy. Seth continued to enjoy a secret life in Egypt, especially amongst the common people, the Reket, traditionally the place where old pagan ways tend to survive. So whereas in the temple, to keep Seth's destructive powers ritually at bay, priests manipulated and destroyed small wax dolls or other inanimate objects as magical substitutes for Seth. So that's what was happening in the temple, presumably, at that time. People were kind of warding off the power of Seth, but however, the spell actually uses the dangerous powers of Seth and directs their destructive energy against a particular individual in a private matter. So the magic is reversed. It manifests itself most explicitly in the donkey's head. According to Herodotus, Egyptian priests never offered an animal's head up to the gods, but cursed it and took it outside the sacred precinct of the temple. So this rite is very opposed to the rules of normal temple ritual. Not just accidentally, there's obviously something deliberate about that. It's deliberately desecrating temple ritual in a way, but the funny thing is the people doing it are probably priests. When the practitioner applies the donkey's blood to one of his hands, he breaks an important taboo of Egyptian temple ritual, and that's connection with blood. Blood was impure. But the magician, who is also probably a priest of some sort, smears it on his or her hand and places it at the corners of their mouth. The magician faces the rising and setting sun. Daybreak and evening are considered opportune moments for the rite because they are at the beginning and end of the sun's nightly journey through the underworld when he has to do battle with the forces of chaos and evil. So by reciting the ritual at the critical moments between light and darkness, the practitioner, who I'll remind you is a priest, takes advantage of the forces of chaos and disorder. Also in Egyptian mythology, the god Seth is part of the sun boat's crew, the crew of Ra's night boat, and he usually exerts his destructive powers to combat the serpent Apophis or Apet, who is the sun god's arch enemy in the underworld. So Seth and the sun god were together in mythology at this moment, at sunrise and sunset. And that's when the magician takes advantage of that to manipulate the situation in a private matter of sending evil sleep to someone he doesn't like. So the rite invokes Seth or Typhon as god of cosmic upheaval, who is hostile to the social order and dwells in foreign countries. The final lines say the practitioner prompts the deity to come to his aid by falsely accusing the victim of having spilled the blood of Typhon. So a little bit unsavory all that in its own way, but by careful detective work we learn a lot about Typhonian magic from just this single example, of which there are many, many which are being analysed. So a few points that stuck in my mind. One, remind you again, the ritual points to the fact of the centrality of dreams within Egyptian magic. Can't be underestimated that. Dream time and dream work is very much an Egyptian magical technique. The second thing to note is that there's a relationship between the gods Seth or Typhon and dream control. The two things are related, and lots of other examples. The manipulation and knowledge of the dream time it's overseen by the god Seth. The third thing is that at this point in history, the sacred animal of Seth is the ass or donkey. Blood was always very important at all stages in magic's history, right from the Neolithic onwards. And of course, Typhonian magic has a very famous ritual connected with the consumption of blood, although it's disguised and eaten in the form of cakes of light. The sixth thing to note is the existence of a secret tradition of Typhonian magic outside of the mainstream of the Egyptian temple. Most people associate magic with Egyptian temple rites. But in fact, the most important focus for Egyptian magic is not the temple. It's the people. It's the pagans, if you like, of the ancient world. It's some of their priests as well often, but they include all sorts of other practitioners who are not particularly involved with the temple anymore, because the temple is in terminal decline anyway. But the fact was, it was always like that the strongest tradition in Egyptian magic is not that kind of highfalutin temple magic, but a much more folksy, earthy tradition. And that's something I've been exploring for a while now, and there are many other aspects of that you can find in my book. Seventh thing to notice is that folk magic that this alludes to is very, very old. It's old enough if it goes back to the time of Christ, but in fact it goes back to before the time of before the Egyptian pharaonic high culture even came to Egypt, back to the Neolithic. There are elements in this type of magic that are as old as humanity itself. And the final thing we learn about is, from this, which is amplified in other areas, is we learn a stellar connection, a connection with stars and with the cycle of day and night. In this case, the ritual is said to be done at dawn and at dusk twilights, which is not exactly, which is the most appropriate time for Typhonian magic. But also, it's funny enough, it's the time when most Egyptian magic is done, in that hour before dawn, which is called the Duat, the twilight, the late, early morning twilight. That's the time when, if you like, the doors between the two worlds are most open. So that's kind of my end of that section, where I've examined a little bit the way we reconstruct techniques and the sort of stuff we've related to in the past. And just briefly, I want to talk now about the myth of the future self, and why this is particularly important to Typhonians. So my third part is the myth, just concerns briefly the myth of the future self. It's connected, you may have picked up that as we went along. The strange thing about Typhonian magic is it's very ancient, but at the same time also points to the future. You see that especially in the Typhon or Seth himself. It's a very, very ancient god, one of the most ancient in Egypt, most original. And there was always a strong association between Seth and meteorites, and between meteorites and meteoric iron. So, meteorite iron. Now, the thing is, the cult of Seth starts in the Stone Age, when the only metals people were really working were gold, and later, towards the end, bronze, of course, but mainly gold. Iron, the Iron Age stuff, is something that comes much, much later. But it's funny how the cult of Seth is very connected with iron, even at a time when there wasn't. The only iron that existed was iron that fell from the sky. So it is kind of like already an idea of pointing to what the future would be like. So one of the many important themes discussed by modern Typhonians is the nature of the future self. It's an insight connected with Kenneth Grant's most focused book, so-called Night Side of Eden. The core of that book, it's a very unusual book, is an elaboration of the holy book Liber 231, which I mentioned earlier. The main theme of which is the tree of death, or the reverse side of the tree of life. Now, previously, the key Kabbalistic diagram could be considered as a maze, complex enough for most according to strict tradition. But Grant has raised the stakes significantly. He's broken that inviolable parameter of the tree and made something new. The tree of death is a labyrinth, dark, uncharted and sinister. So what we're talking about here is that you've got the tree of life and you think there'd be enough mystery in that, but in a sense Crowley and Kenneth Grant point to a new tree of life, one that's to be explored in the future, one that's very connected with the future, and sometimes called the tree of death or the tree of good and evil, or the reverse side of the tree of life. So it's kind of quite spooky, unusual stuff, this. And this has developed a thing called the Shadow Tarot, right? Which, you know, the Shadow Tarot and the shadows occur long before Babylon 5 and all that sort of stuff. And what the Shadow Tarot is about, as far as I can say, is the traffic with future selves. Now, as occultists and as New Age people and whatever, we're all very familiar with the idea that people wanted to explore their past selves through things like past life regression and everything that goes with that. But in a way, the past is gone. The past is less real than the future. The past is definitely gone, as the future is coming into being, isn't it? You know, the sort of threads of it are already here. So what the Typhonians would say is that the future is more real than the past, and one way or another we're all going to have a future self. I mean, it might be a future self in the sense of what you're going to be in 10 years' time or what you're going to be in 20 years' time, but you might also think, well, what are you going to be in another life? What's going to happen to you and your memories and your personality in 100 years' time or 1,000 years' time? There's going to be another version of you somewhere in the world in the future. And that future self, in a way, is probably more useful to you, even if you see this as a kind of mind game, right? It's more useful concept to you now than your past lives, because the future, so the theory goes, has more insight than our past selves. So we all have future selves. We can all at least imagine in them what that might be and what we'd like that to be. And our future self is something that we very much need at the moment. We need to know that we've got a future and that the future self can help us in some ways. It's a big subject to go into, but I just want to finish by saying that Typhonian Magick, one of the things about Typhonian Magick, the most interesting aspects of Typhonian Magick, is Typhonian Magick is one of the keys to the mysteries of what our future selves might have to say to us.